Hi guys! Today we're going to talk about knit fabric and all the different types of knit fabric in our world. So last class we discussed the difference between woven fabric and knit fabric. But it's a very important distinction and it's really crucial to know, so let's go over it again. It's crucial for every fashion designer or interior designer to know the difference between knits and wovens, because what garments and how you make those garments will change depending on whether the fabric is knit or woven. So we make garments differently if they are made from knit fabric as opposed to woven fabric. If you look closely at the fabric surface, you can probably tell whether it's a knit or whether it's a woven. Woven fabrics will tend to look like this image on the left, with many crisscrossing yarns coming at a perpendicular angle to one another. So this little sort of straight up and down lines with horizontal lines coming through them. The knit fabric, on the other hand, will have little V shapes on the face side of the fabric. Oops, sorry about that. Woven fabrics are made by using two sets of many yarns, a length or warp set of yarn and a cross, weft, or filler set of yarns. These yarns are interlocked together, and because of this interlocking, most woven fabrics will have a crisscross pattern to them, and also they will not stretch unless spandex is added to the fiber mix that makes up the yarns. So one good way to tell if a piece of fabric is woven and not knit is to see if it stretches. If it does not stretch, it is woven. Knit fabrics are made by creating a row of loops, then looping a subsequent row of loops through that previous row. This can be done with one continuous yarn or more if more colors or different patterns are desired. Because of this looping structure, all knits have stretch to them. The yarns are not tightly packed together, as we can see here. There's a little bit of space in each link of the loop. And this little bit of space gives a little bit of stretch or give to each loop interlooping. So the yarn itself does not need to be stretchy for a knit fabric to be stretchy. In fact, before that there was spandex, the knit structure was the only way we could have stretchy fabrics. However, with the advent of spandex, we can add that stretchy fiber to woven yarn. This means we can have woven fabrics that stretch too. So, because a fabric stretches doesn't automatically mean that it's knit. This animation is showing in a small scale 4 stitches. It's getting cut off at the end, but this is how a knitting machine will knit fabrics. So traditionally, of course, we knit by hand, just like we would weave by hand. And one doesn't need a complicated loom to knit by hand, they just need yarn and knitting needles. It's a rather simple process, but of course we have made more complex machines to be able to create knit fabric at a faster and smaller scale than what you're used to seeing in a home setting. The composition of knit fabric. This is the basic composition of knit fabric. The first element we're going to learn about is the course. So, as we watched in the other animations, a knit fabric is made by laying down a row of looped yarns. Then, another row of loops is looped through the first one, and then another, and then another. These rows of loops are called courses. Each loop is called a stitch. Once we start stacking our rows or courses of loops upon each other, we get additional columns of loops called wales. The wales are formed because we set every loop on top of the previous loop. Put together, we get our courses and wales. They make up the grain of the knit fabric. So the wales can be likened to the lengthwise grain of the fabric, of the woven fabric. And the courses can be likened to the crosswise grain of the woven fabric. Because they are similar, the wales run lengthwise through the fabric, and the courses run crosswise. Because of this looped construction, again, all knit fabrics have some stretch to them. This is the most common structure and pattern of knit. There are different ones, but this one is called weft knit. The knit stitch. On a typical knit piece of fabric, the face side of the fabric will show the knit stitch. The knit stitch looked like this little V shape right here. And you can see it's a loop. This is the front side of the loop, and it's going underneath this part in the back here. You can't see it, but it's in there, which is the other loop coming out of it, and then another loop coming out of it. This V-shaped pattern is created by the interlocking loops. The purl stitch. On a typical knit fabric, the wrong or back side of the fabric will show the purl stitch. The purl stitch looks like sort of a smushed oval shape with somewhat pointed ends, and they're staggered like a brick pattern would be staggered. So every stitch or loop that you have on a knit fabric has a face or knit side or a purl or back side. Yarn weights. So the weight of a yarn used to knit a piece of fabric will have a big impact on the resulting fabric, just like we learned in the yarn section. And everything we learned in the yarn section applies here to using yarns in our knitting process. The image to the left is a guide for craft knitters, but the same ideas apply to commercial knits as well, but in somewhat different ways. The main difference is that craft knitters use typically larger weights of yarn because they're easier to knit. You can go pretty big on knitting machines as well, but they definitely have the ability to knit some very incredibly fine yarns, finer than would be workable to do by hand. The finer the yarn, the thinner and more delicate a piece of fabric will be knitted. The thicker the yarn, the chunkier the knit fabric that is created. As we can see here, we have the different weights of yarns that are common for craft knitters. They run from lace to jumbo. Here the sizes are listed in stitches per 4 inches. As you can see, finer yarns will have more stitches per inch. Stitches per inch is somewhat like threads per inch in woven fabrics. The higher number indicates a finer yarn. The needle size also gets adjusted by what size yarn that you choose. The size of needle used to make your knit is called a needle gauge, the gauge of the needle referring to its size. Usually, needle size or needle gauge is about equal or balanced with the yarn size. So finer or smaller gauge needles will be used for finer yarns, larger needles for larger, thicker yarns. However, sometimes we differ the needle size from the yarn size that we're using, and this can create different effects. For example, if you use needles that are much larger than your yarn weight, you will create a loose, open, often transparent knit. If using needles that are much smaller than your yarn, this will create a dense, tightly packed fabric. Flat knitting. Flat knitting is the most basic structure of knitting. It is simple, and it means that the knitting process creates a flat piece of fabric. This is usually how we are used to seeing fabrics, as it resembles the flat nature of woven fabrics. Flat knitting can be created by industrial knitting as well as by hand. Here we see the traditional craft method of knitting, which is just done with 2 needles and a ball of yarn, not shown, but we can see the thread being fed in from here. And we create and interlock the loops just by using the needle and looping the yarn over the needle and then pulling it through each knit one at a time. It is quite a slow process. I've never quite had the patience for knitting by hand using needles, although it's fun to try once or twice. Over here is a flat knit machine. So an industrial machine used to knit very, very quickly. This is what it looks like in a commercial sense. What the flat knitting machine is showing on the left hand is actually a specific kind of knitting called piece knitting. So when we knit a piece of fabric, one of 2 things will happen. We will just knit a large, flat, rectangular piece, which will then be cut to make garments. This is called cut and sew knits. So the fabric, if you're going to buy fabric from a fabric store and it's knit, it will come in this manner. You will cut the pattern shapes out of the fabric and then sew them together. Alternatively, you can make what is called a piece knit. This is where the pattern pieces for the garment are knit according to their shape. So nothing has to be cut out. All the pieces to the garment are already created in the knitting process. Each piece of the pattern will then be sewn together, or knit together rather, to create their garment. So you can see as this piece is coming out, it's not quite rectangular. We're getting a slightly bigger here, over here, looking like we're going to have a slightly round collar piece right here. There's going to actually be a shape. It's not just going to be a regular rectangle like we're used to seeing. The actual shape of the pattern piece is going to be printed out, or knit out, I should say. It looks like it's being printed out. Then those pieces are put together. It's a very nice and fine style of knitting that you're going to see in higher end knit garments. The other main style of knitting is called knitting in the round or circular knitting. They are done in different machines, both by hand and by the machine. On the left, we can see a circular knitting machine on the commercial or industrial scale. Here we can see it's still a knitting machine, not quite hand knitting, but on the craft scale. And you can actually see a lot easier what's going on with the circular knitting. So when we knit circularly, a flat piece of fabric does not come out. A tube of fabric comes out. And you can see here's the open end of the tube as it's being knit. And here what comes out, it's a flattened tube, but it goes all the way around just like that in a circle or a tube. As you can imagine, this is how most hats are made. Many other garments are also made using circular knitting, as humans are roughly tube-shaped as well. You can also circular knit or knit in the round using needles, but you use a 4 set of needles sort of linked together. It's rather tricky. I've never gotten the hang of it. But I do own this guy, which is the Addy Express. And it is a craft knitter, and you can make great hats. You can make a single layer beanie in about a half an hour, and a double layer one in about an hour. I recommend it. This concludes our first section in knit composition. Please join me in my next section about different types of weft knits.